Welcome to another episode of the CTO to CTO podcast. In today's Pioneers episode, our guest is Adam Sturrock, the founder of Moltin and MACH Alliance ambassador. Piotr and Adam discuss the beginnings of Moltin and what it was like to build a successful startup in Newcastle, England, back in 2013. Adam also talks about the struggles of moving to Silicon Valley, his first six-figure deals, empowering developers, consulting companies on headless architecture decisions, and the lifecycle of companies. Let's begin.
In today's episode, we are going to talk about e-commerce platforms. My guest is Adam Sturrock, the founder of Moltin, one of the first, if not the first, headless e-commerce platform. Adam is a great source of insight. Recently, he created the eCommerce Magic Roundabout 2020, showing how the enterprise e-commerce platforms are doing. I can't wait to ask him more about it. Hey, Adam, I'm so glad you accepted my invitation.
No problem. Nice to be here.
Perfect. Adam, do you see yourself as a pioneer?
Yes and no. I guess I suffer a little bit from sort of imposter syndrome. Like I just feel like, I guess like everything that sort of I work on is more evolutionary rather than revolutionary.
Yeah, gotcha. I think many people do see you as a pioneer because Moltin for many of us was the first contact with the headless e-commerce concept, API first concept. Back in 2013 when you started, have you even used the word headless for what were you building?
Headless wasn't really a thing back in 2013. We described Moltin as an e-commerce API. APIs were a thing in 2013. We looked at sort of Stripe and Twilio, and that's sort of, we thought, why not the whole, the whole e-commerce platform, basically. It took us a while to kind of move away from talking about like e-commerce APIs and tech, and I think it was Commerce Tools that was the first one to use headless, and then we quickly followed suit. It's a great term to use to kind of get the business stakeholders' interest, I guess, but it's not necessarily a great term beyond that.
Gotcha. So you started, doing this before it got popular. How did this idea of the API first e-commerce platform come to you? How it come from?
So 2013, and casting back to sort of the beginning, I was working in an agency with my two co-founders, Jamie and Chris. And we worked with WordPress, Magento, Shopify. We built our own e-commerce plugin called FireSale for a Laravel-based CMS called Pyro CMS at the time. And we came across the same issues like when we built that plugin that sort of we were facing with Magento and WordPress in terms of the maintenance headaches, like having to run those servers, and we had like hundreds of clients all running different versions of those platforms.
Right.
And then that's on one side of the spectrum from the maintenance and sort of the scaling issues and things. There are obviously the requirements as well that you get from a client when you're working in an agency, where maybe Shopify wasn't a good fit and you had to do a lot of customization, and there was a lot of proprietary frameworks and ways of doing things that you sort of had to learn and pick up. I remember sort of my first 6 months I wasn't allowed to touch a production website, which is kind of crazy. There was I guess a lot of training that sort of had to be done, a lot of learning. So we thought like I said, we looked at sort of Stripe and Twilio, and they were really easy. Like the developer experience was great. It abstracted away a lot of the complexity and sort of handled a lot of the infrastructure for the developer. So maybe a bit of naivety, but we thought, why not do that for the entire e-commerce platform as an API, and that would sort of solve those maintenance and upgrade cycles and things, and the scaling issues. We would sort of handle that for people, and from a flexibility standpoint, that separation of the front end from the back end would mean that you could bring whatever programming language, like frameworks, tools, whatever you're comfortable with, you could pick up and use, and there wouldn't be like a lengthy learning cycle or like a training program or anything like that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think that this is the shift of the paradigm how you make the software, because before that you mentioned Magento, WordPress. In those two cases, but not only, it was like you were always creating kind of extensions, modules, how they name it.
Yeah, I sort of see it as like an anti-pattern. Like it ends up creating like spaghetti code and like dependencies on each other, and it's like things start to break at scale.
Absolutely. And with this headless approach, you are rather creating a separate apps, which gives you a whole new level of flexibility, right?
Yeah, you get flexibility. You can get complexity inside of that as well.
Yeah.
But at least there are tools and ways in which you can work with that complexity to sort of minimize some of those issues, which maybe don't necessarily exist in a monolithic approach.
Right. That makes perfect sense. Tell us about your founding team and how did you build the MVP?
So, like I said, we're sort of 3 developers in the agency. We all had sort of experience with Magento and PHP, building our own plugins and things. We all quit our jobs at the same time. I remember we lined our notices up in envelopes on my boss's desk, and that was like half the engineering team walking out at that point. We joined an accelerator program. So I'm based in Newcastle in the UK, Northeast. Yep. And there's an accelerator program up here called Ignite 100. So that kind of gave us the funding to kind of do this without like bootstrapping it. I think bootstrapping it back then would have been really, really tough for us. From a personal growth sort of standpoint, we were 3 developers, like not much sort of sales or marketing experience. But yeah, the accelerator gave us that funding to build the product. I remember sort of the 3 months on that accelerator, everyone was sort of like pitching and selling and like building their companies, and we were just building a product. Like you can't sell an e-commerce platform without actually having it exist. So
absolutely, yeah.
So that's kind of what we focused on, sort of the critical path: product, cart, checkout, order. And within 3 months, we launched. I think it was like August, September time, like 2013. We launched the product. And sort of like from day one, we had a sort of the ethos of sort of developer first, go to market, attract the developers, like scratch your own itch kind of business. And then the developer would sort of fall in love with the APIs and the abstraction and sort of the experience, how easy it was. And yeah, from day one, like we were saw developers signing up from like all over the world, like other people just like us were searching for the tool that we wanted to exist. I remember that we had like I can't remember the guy's name now, but we ended up printing out his email. It was like a paragraph, like a wall of text with no punctuation, and he was like furious. He sent an email like I think it was like midnight his time, and he was just complaining that like he's annoyed that we didn't exist before because he just spent like 3 months building his girlfriend's jewelry website from scratch, like without Magento or Shopify or anything. And like he's going to rebuild the whole thing on Moltin because it was like way better and easier and solved all of his problems.
Was he your first adopter?
Yeah, he was the first one that like launched a store on top of us that we sort of noticed. And that was sort of good, sort of I guess early indications of product market fit. Like there are different definitions of product market fit, and I feel like we kind of finally got there like a few years later. But that was sort of the early signals that we were sort of onto something. Yeah, that we had sort of inbound traffic from organic search, people searching e-commerce API, and sort of Moltin was one of the only ones sort of there on the Google page for that search term. I remember sort of we also faced scaling challenges from day one. Sort of launching a global product like that, we had people signing up from New Zealand, and we had AWS servers in Europe. So you can imagine like the round trip time, like latency. Like even then, people were like really really happy with it, and they would just sort of manage the caching on their side, and sort of just make it work. But yeah, that was like 3-4 second like API response times just from the network latency geographically. So But yeah, there was a shoe brand in New Zealand called Yours. That was one of the first, I would sort of say, brands that we sort of saw that wasn't just like a hobbyist developer, but someone with a real business that was sort of scaling up. And they launched on Moltin, and that was really cool to see. There was a lot of these sort of like little small micro moments and little milestones that we were sort of seeing as we sort of had that sort of bottoms up approach in our initial like go-to-market strategy.
That sounds fantastic. Before I go further with the question, I must ask you one more question. It's about Newcastle, you know?
Sure,
I was there once, quite accidentally. I remember the city is more or less the size of Wrocław, my city.
Yeah, it's quite a small city centre, like it's kind of like compared to like London or like something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
You can walk from one side to the other in like 10 minutes of the centre.
Exactly. So it absolutely doesn't look like, Silicon Valley or something like this.
Yeah.
So the question is, how is to start the business in Newcastle? Do you see this as a challenge or rather an opportunity?
I think it's both. So like very early on, it was a huge challenge for us from a fundraising perspective. Like, who are these three guys from Newcastle? Like, no one had ever really heard of us. And I think sort of like the positive side of that is that it's very cheap, or it was very cheap. I don't know whether that's still the case anymore, but it was very cheap from a cost of living perspective, like in the northeast of England. So like, even if we couldn't raise a lot of money, we didn't need a lot of money. So you could hire developers like for like half the price of a London salaried developer, for example. And there wasn't much of a startup ecosystem when we started the company. And we grew pretty rapidly compared to the rest of the Newcastle ecosystem with the funding and the accelerator programs that we went through and things. So we very quickly were able to hire like the best talent in Newcastle at the time, sort of assemble it from all the different agencies in the area. So there's a lot of good talent from a technical standpoint in Newcastle. I think it used to be like one of the Newcastle's best kept secrets, but I think like a lot of companies have been moving in now and realizing they can kind of move outside of like the tech hubs in like London and Berlin and things, which is like really like exciting. But at the same time, obviously with Brexit and the sort of EU funding being pulled from the northeast regions, like it feels like the startup ecosystem is collapsing a little bit right now. Like this year and last year especially, like Ignite 100, there was a co-working space where all the sort of the tech startups were sort of based from. Sort of funded by the EU, and sort of some of the Moltin's early investors sort of got EU funding and that kind of thing. But that sort of is being pulled now, so that's like shrinking pretty rapidly, which is a bit unfortunate and sort of disappointing. I don't see the UK government rushing to replace that level of support.
Gotcha.
So it's probably really tough now to like do something in Newcastle than it was a few years ago. There was like a sweet spot in a moment in time.
Yeah, thank you for this answer. I absolutely agree with you. Like when we founded View Storefront in Wrocław, it gave us also much longer runway given the cost of development and talents we could find here. So it's absolutely an opportunity, I guess. Okay, cool. After 2 years or so, you applied to YCombinator, second accelerator after Ignite 100. Why did you decide for this move?
So we were I think there was like 3 or 4 of us at the time, and we were trying to fundraise in London, and all the VC there's maybe like 1 or 2 like partners at the VCs, like maybe they were like American or like from Israel or things like that. They knew what an API was, but the majority of London-based VCs were very much sort of into fintech or like B2C companies and investments, and they didn't even know what an API was. So like,
gotcha.
You can imagine how the starts of those like conversations would go. Like you would have to like not talk about what you were doing. You would have to explain a technical concept first, and that was never going to go anywhere. Like we had like dozens of conversations with VCs, and they just didn't understand. So we realized like we were speaking to a guy. I don't know if you know him, Gil Dibner. He used to work at DFJ, and he sort of he came up from London. Like that never happens. Like you don't get London-based VCs coming up to Newcastle ever. Like he was the first one to make that that move to come and see us, and he sort of recommended that we go and apply to YCombinator. We were also being sort of approached by 500 startups at the time, so we had sort of options on the table as to kind of if YC didn't work out for whatever reason, we could apply to 500 startups. So we would sort of have like get out of the Newcastle ecosystem a little bit and get I guess more aligned with Silicon Valley. I guess that was we were sort of isolated a little bit in Newcastle, and people hadn't really heard of us, and we needed some stamps of credibility. And I think sort of why we applied to YC thinking that they would give that stamp of credibility, which they did. And it also sort of began to teach us a little bit more, not just about building product, but also about sort of go-to-market strategy and how do we evolve that, how do we begin to acquire customers, sort of how do we sell Moltin beyond just like building some APIs, which are cool. which is helpful. So we ended up. It was like late 2015. I had to apply for a passport. We applied like 2 hours before the deadline. Recorded the video just off the cuff. There was sort of no rehearsal. We just sort of said, we've got this e-commerce platform as an API. We've got hundreds of developers signing up every month, like playing around with it and using it and things. So we kind of had the product and had some early traction and early adoption. And I think those two things kind of showed YC that we were sort of like making something that maybe people wanted. And obviously time has sort of proven that like e-commerce APIs and headless is now like a thing in the industry that everyone's moving towards. We were very early, I think, from a timing perspective. But yeah, we applied to YC. We flew out there. The interview was like 10 minutes long. There was like 4 partners, and it was Jamie and I. So there was just like questions like flying left and right that we're still having to like answer and deflect to try and keep the conversation on track. And then that evening we got accepted. We got the phone call that we were on the batch. So ended up having to call my fiance at the time and say like we're going to Silicon Valley for a few months and that kind of thing. So it was kind of tough personally. That was like a really hard time. But yeah, we moved to Silicon Valley for a few months for the YC program in January the following year. And we started focusing on sort of the developer experience, the onboarding experience, trying to sort of figure out how do we in some ways diversify our go-to-market strategy just away from organic search, but also like thinking about organic search in a lot more depth around sort of content strategies. But we were doing sort of like SEO by accident. It was more like just reverse engineering what we would search for, as opposed to like latching on to like adjacent technologies and integrations and companies.
Gotcha.
That was sort of like would help supercharge, because like people would be searching for like JavaScript e-commerce, or like over time obviously the Jamstack sort of came about and they would be searching for like React e-commerce and that kind of thing. So we would have landing pages and sort of guides and content around building those things. But it really started at YC when we started to like become a bit more sophisticated.
That's interesting. My next question is actually about this, how you pivoted the product over the years, because as you started explaining, you were also adapting to the trends like Jamstack and other
so
things.
It was kind of like, it felt like the Wild West, I guess. Like in 2013, like there was like jQuery, like that kind of thing. There wasn't any JavaScript framework, so to speak, sort of in the market. So yeah, the product we built initially on the accelerator program, because we only had like 3 developers and like 3 months, you can imagine it was just sort of like thrown together as quickly as possible to get to like a MVP product. It was a PHP monolith, so something that we were sort of familiar with. And it was sort of sellotaped and duct taped together. And it was good enough to like get started to kind of just prove that you could build an e-commerce API and that people would use it. But then we saw sort of between 2013 and mid 2015, we saw sort of scaling challenges as some larger companies started to get onboarded onto the platform, like mid-market companies that actually had like volume of traffic and like cart interactions and checkouts and sales. We saw, especially like around like holiday periods, we saw like the system began to like struggle. There would be bottlenecks in the architecture decisions that we made early on to be like rushing. So we ended up sort of moving from version 1 of the PHP monolith to like rewriting the platform entirely. So we made a lot of mistakes like building our fire sale plugin before that, and then we made a lot of mistakes with our V1 product, and then for V2 we moved to a microservice architecture. And sort of at that point, it wasn't just PHP anymore. Yes, there was a little bit of PHP for some services, but there was Node, there was Go, there was Ruby. We started to diversify the tech stack then, and maybe it went too far at one point, and we kind of had to rein it back in a little bit in like early 2019. But like we were like very much sort of right tool for the job in terms of the architecture, like specializing. At that point, we couldn't even like, we were contemplating do we open source this thing and then like do the hosting for people and the service on top. But we realized that people wouldn't even be able to like host it themselves. Like, even if it was open source, it would be impossible. It was too specialized at that point. So yeah, it was sort of an interesting journey, but obviously like over time. So maybe a bit on sort of the hats as a founder that I wore through that time. All 3 of us were developers, but I was I guess most commercially minded. I leaned more towards sort of sales and marketing, and that grew over time. So I kind of moved away from product. So by like 2018, 2019, I didn't really have as much insight into the internal architecture as I had earlier on. It got way more complicated, and I could sort of understand the diagrams, but I couldn't draw one for you because there was so many moving parts. I would do the abstract version, which was simplified.
I think it's natural transition, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Like it's sort of people gravitate towards sort of what they're good at or what they're interested in. So yeah, I guess I was running the sales and marketing team before we raised like Series A's and that kind of thing. Without we had like 2 or 3 people on this sort of marketing side. I remember sort of our first like deal, 6-figure deals, was myself and one solution engineer that we'd hired from Twilio. And that worked out really well. That was like the data points that led to our Series A. But we were just sort of figuring out the playbook ourselves, just like looking across at Stripe and Twilio and other API companies like Contentful and Algolia, and just sort of almost like, I guess, imitating what they were doing as best as we could understand. Like I think it became more apparent later on, like that what we were trying to execute was like a product-led growth strategy. And there's like productled.com. There are books about this now and things, but that didn't exist back then. Like now it does, so it's a lot easier for people to sort of grasp what that entails and what it means.
That was actually my next question. Like, what was the key driver of the Moltin culture? I mean, a company can be driven by many different factors. Like some companies are product driven, some companies are sales driven, some companies are tech driven. What was Moltin driven?
We really cared about that developer experience, so we had a bit of a chip on our shoulder with sort of the existing platforms and the enterprise sales model and things, and maybe we thought that the developer should be empowered to make those technology decisions for the business, like what was right for sort of what the business was trying to do. So that was sort of our culture initially. That sort of led us down that developer go-to-market approach. That changed over time. Like culturally, we had a really strong culture from like 2013 to like 2017-ish. But over time, that began to change. So like as we raised funding, we were pushed to commercialize, and I look back and maybe we were pushed too early to commercialize. Sort of, I see something in that product-led strategy. If you look at Contentful or Algolia or something, you have the developer go to market, and you might not make money or much money off of that, but it's about mind share. It's about getting market penetration and getting everyone aware of your product, or as many people as possible, so that if someone thinks of search, they think of Algolia. If someone thinks of content, they think of Contentful. If someone thinks of e-commerce, we were hoping they would think of Moltin. That was sort of the strategy. But over time, like as we were trying to find product market fit, as you can imagine, like attracting like tens of hundreds of developers into the platform every month, it was noisy. There was a lot of people in there that were kicking the tires. A lot of people that would like sign up for 5 minutes, like check it out a little bit, and then disappear and things. So we had like a very leaky like funnel, and then we had like live chat on the website and things, and that's actually how we managed to speak to the. I guess we'd sort of talk about them as sort of diamonds in the rough, where we would actually find companies that like serious companies that would actually want to use Moltin, and sort of it was like a timing thing as well, being there at the right time for them to discover us. So a lot of things sort of had to go right. Sort of the stars would have to align to find that perfect like company that would like pick up and use Moltin and pay like 6-figure sums every year for it. But they did exist. We got a few of those without a sales team when we were sort of very much sort of focused on product, and that sales process was very like solution engineering. It wasn't we spoke directly to the CTOs and the developers, which like it kind of works for like I guess like startups, new D2C brands which are smaller, and there's like the decision maker is empowered to make that purchase. But we kind of found when we got more like larger companies in our sales pipeline, the decisions were made by non-technical stakeholders or by boards or by board members.
Absolutely.
It became tougher. We sort of had to cross the bridge from a technical, like an easy technical sale, to like something that was like less technical. And I think that's why you saw like terms like Headless appear, which is like it kind of gives you the opportunity to talk about the technology and the benefits that it can bring to the company. But suddenly, like in the enterprise space, it's very it affects, like a commerce platform affects everybody inside of a company. It's like one of the core components. It's like the core engine. So everyone wants to say, everyone wants to know what their day-to-day life is going to be like after the integration. Which makes it really tough. So like as we drifted more towards, like coming back around to the question, as we drifted towards the enterprise space, especially like 2018, 2019 post Series A, as we commercialized, the culture changed as we hired like sales team in Boston and that kind of thing, as we tried to like get into the US market. It was very tough. Like it began to we had like fractures inside the team.
Interesting. Yeah, that was a really interesting answer. Also, you touched this technology adoption curve problem where you are getting from the early adopters to majority, which usually, especially from the enterprise, is backed by those business decision makers. I see the same for the projects I was engaged in. It's a totally different story. Like if you are starting with the tech trends like Headless, you are talking to CTOs and it's always very merit based and very tech based, and then you need to convince those business guys, which is actually much more difficult. But if you do, those are the folks who have the budgets.
Yeah, like we got better at it over time. Like it was a lot of trial and error to get to that point. By 2019, like mid 2019, like we pulled our developer go to market entirely so we could focus on that enterprise space, and that's when we really found product market fit for our product. And I think that just in some ways speaks volumes to the maturity of where Headless is right now in the market, in terms of it's got a high barrier to entry, so you kind of need the developers and the budget to kind of implement, and it exceeds beyond just like the ecom platform. It's like all of these other best-in-class solutions, just like yourself, like and like with Vue Storefront, and then like on the front end, like we solved half of the problem. And there's the Headless CMS, there's Headless Search, there's promotion engines, tax, shipping. Like there's a very long list of things that would need to be sold alongside Moltin. So that was also added complexity for both us in the sales process, like trying to maintain control, and for the buyer, the customer, like to be able to like piece together a full solution. Like it's like people kind of walked in expecting a full suite, just like Salesforce Commerce Cloud or like Magento, whatever commerce platform they were familiar with. That's what they were kind of expecting, and it was completely alien to them that they would kind of walk in and have to think about the entire architecture as a whole with all these different pieces. But if you look at sort of how a company implements a monolithic platform, like they use plugins. Like over time, they adapt their initial. Like,
isn't this, Adam, like a reverse sequence of problems? Like when you picking this monolithic platforms, you think you have everything needed to run it, everything under control, and it's just like out of the box solution. But it actually isn't. Like in the end, you need to figure out all the problems, and sometimes you have even problems you were not expecting, like performance, maintainability problems, and other stuff. And with this Headless, you have to figure out those things at first place, but then it's much easier, right?
Yeah, exactly. It makes you do that thinking up front. So like I sort of see it as like, it sounds like a platform sounds, a monolithic platform sounds great initially, and then over time you drift from the path, and then you install the plugins, and then you have like dependency issues between those plugins, and it becomes a mess over like the course of 3 to 5 years, and then you get into the replatforming cycle where you blame the platform and you go find another platform, and then it's like a really big upheaval, and it's high risk, like hopefully high reward, but it can be a mess. And then you just, we saw it at the agencies, like people would like move from one platform to another every like 3 to 5 years. So that in sort of the Headless world, like you break that cycle, because instead of replatforming the entire thing, like up front you're thinking, these are the components that I need we use diagrams to sort of sell Moltin, because like people couldn't grasp, there's no sort of front end, so they couldn't sort of see what they were sort of like building, and it was like a very different way of thinking. So we ended up like having diagrams with like placeholders for like gaps, for like things that we thought they might need, and then we would sort of ask them what they have today, and sort of we would help them sort of transition from whatever the architecture was to something new. And that was sort of chipping away maybe at the monolith. Sometimes it was like a full rebuild, but there was a few different approaches to sort of making that successful. But yeah, I think it's a good idea to sort of have that planning up front as to, okay, like you're kind of walking in with your eyes wide open as to all these like components and sort of what they're designed to do, and you end up with a system that's greater than the sum of its parts, because they're all best of breed, and they all sort of compound the value of each other, and you're able to leverage, like on the front end you get like performance impacts for like how quickly your website loads, which is great. Like that sort of occurred over time as the Jamstack sort of came about. Obviously that increases like SEO and search engine ranking results, and on page conversion. So like they're very easy things to measure. So like when you're trying to prove the ROI to like a business stakeholder, like that's what a lot of CTOs sort of led with. But then there's sort of the more sort of, I guess, the process stuff internally, sort of how quickly can you fulfill an order, like the administration experience, like of like different team members, like people living inside of PIMs and order management systems, depending on their job titles. Absolutely, and things. Maybe they didn't even know that Moltin existed. Like they never, like Moltin was sort of just connecting everything together, and people just lived in different tools.
The platforms are getting more and more into a utility role, which is on one side great, on the other side it's difficult, because it just works. Nobody wants to change it after the decision has been made to start with one or other platform. But the other challenge is that because its utility is getting more and more
commoditized.
It's getting, commoditized. Exactly.
Well, that's what we thought of. Had the thought. Stripe has like payment infrastructure, like Molten sort of thought process was sort of like e-commerce infrastructure, where like it's like electricity, like you just turn it on wherever you need it, whatever the component was. So that's sort of that utility sort of concept, like really like speaks truth to sort of the APIs sort of movement, but yeah, you can, especially now, 2020, like you can see the commoditization happening. Like every few weeks, I see another new headless e-commerce platform appearing. And I don't know if you checked out the jamstack.org website, they've got like a headless CMS section, and there's at least 50 headless CMSs now. And it's becoming problematic to like know which one to kind of go with. Like obviously you've got the early players into the market that have sort of established some mind share, but it's also becoming easier to create these platforms as well. At least on the CMS side, e-commerce platforms are a little bit harder, because they've got like logic and processing that you kind of have to think about, like with the cart and the tax calculations and shipping, and there's like a lot more complexity there. But people can still do it, like because you have all the best of breed providers that you can kind of rely on to kind of plug the gaps.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, thank you. You finally left Moltin. It was officially this year or end of the 2019?
So Moltin was acquired in November 2019, but I left Elastic Path like mid-February officially. And
what's your next challenge?
So I guess like what I'm up to right now. So I moved back to the UK from Boston. I was in Boston for a few months through 2019 and sort of the start of 2020. So just moved back before sort of COVID hit, like 1 week before the lockdowns in the UK. So kind of in some ways sort of lucky to get out of the US and sort of get back with family. So we're saving for a house right now. We've got like, we're getting money together for a deposit. We've got a bit of cash from the acquisition and things. But the housing market's a little bit it's a bit of an interesting time. Like people are moving out of the cities, and I'm in a village right now called Rothbury, about half an hour drive from Newcastle. So a lot of people are moving out of the cities. So like houses go really quickly. In terms of like actually buying a house, I need to have. I've set up a consulting practice while I figure out what I want to do next, and I need 1 year of accounts to buy a house. So that'll be April before I have a year of accounts together. By that point, I'll have a decent sized deposit as well. So we'll be able to sort of get ourselves sort of set up and have some stability in our lives after 7 years in sort of startup mode. But sort of beyond that, I guess my real challenge that I'm sort of struggling with is sort of figuring out what I want to do next outside of sort of product marketing consulting and solution architect consulting. It's sort of I've got a bit of like analysis paralysis. There's a lot of companies chasing me, and I'm also like I feel like the consulting stuff is kind of fun as well. That I'm sort of able to help a lot of people. I feel like the thing that I get the biggest, like I guess, kick from, or the most sort of the most like the thing that I feel good about, I guess, is helping retailers and brands sort of navigate like Mac and headless architecture decisions.
Yep.
Because it's really hard. Like even for me, like I'm in the space, I live and breathe it every day, and even I struggle sometimes, like with like how quickly the space is moving, and sort of trying to keep aware of like broader market movements and all the new vendors that are kind of coming in and how they kind of compete. And there's a lot of blurring of lines. So I'm trying to stay one step ahead of the retailers and brands to sort of help teach them.
Makes perfect sense, and I think this role kind of strategy / solution architectural role is very important, and also your recent publication, the e-commerce Magic Roundabout, is a step towards helping the folks to navigate this enterprise e-commerce space. Can you tell us a little bit more about this publication?
Yeah, the roundabout. So, like at Moltin, we sort of worked with Gartner and Forrester, and I sort of had like issues with sort of how they would sort of publish and sort of rank and score vendors. You would see sort of the monolithic players like maintaining leadership positions for far too long when they're being whilst they're being disrupted by other new more innovative startups. So they would sort of cling on for longer, and I thought maybe like it would be good to just publish like what's actually happening. Sort of taking some ideas from like the Magic Quadrant and things, but also applying sort of like crossing the chasm like components to that, and sort of the life cycle of a company, and sort of it's almost like a bit like a clock where like a company starts at the top left hand quadrant, like the innovators, and then they kind of have to cross the chasm to get into sort of being like in the winning category, and then sort of over time.
How long does the cycle take? I'm wondering.
The cycle, in terms of sort of how long it takes, I guess it fluctuates. It depends on each company. 5 to 10 years for like big shifts in the market, I would say. Like in terms of like the phases, the generational phases that we kind of go through. I think companies try to fight the decline once you become sort of when you get really big, and you're wanting to sort of maintain that growth curve. It gets harder and harder, and eventually you're going to become disrupted. And I feel like that's a good sort of tie into sort of the Jeff Bezos sort of Amazon like day zero mentality, where you've got to keep reinventing yourself every single day, because if you don't, you're gonna fall into insignificance. And eventually your company's going to die. So that's kind of what I see. Sort of like, yes, Shopify, BigCommerce, and Commerce Tools are all in the wedge of winners right now, and there are new commerce platforms and APIs kind of coming across the chasm as we speak, but kind of the old guard, I kind of put them in the lower half of my diagram, in sort of the like, there's a creek of complacency when they think they're like they're too big to fail, and then like if the product vision does not progress, like someone else is going to like replace you basically, and sort of like take a leapfrog approach and kind of jump over what you've sort of executed on and fix some of the problems with your product. So you kind of have to be constantly aware and honest with yourself as to kind of what are the pros and cons of your product that you're selling into the market. And I see it as sort of like a pendulum swing between sort of, we have monoliths and then we have fragmentation with microservices, and we're probably going to be going back again somewhere when like instead of having suites we have stacks, and there's going to be like tools that kind of come together and that sort of orchestrate all of these different best of breed providers together, sort of with an out of the box solution. So you get the benefits of flexibility with the benefits of speed. And it's difficult to build that from a place where you've got kind of a monolithic platform. You kind of have to do it from a place of fragmentation to start with. So I've placed a lot of the monoliths in the bottom half, and they're fighting against that. So you've seen the recent acquisition of Mobify by Salesforce Commerce Cloud. They're trying to put the headless like front end on top of their monolith, so like a hybrid approach, which they're fighting against the change. They need to think about the internal architecture. They've got demandware, and that's really old internal architecture is like showing its age now. They need to be thinking about like to reinvent themselves. They have to acquire an e-commerce API. Like that's they have to like to stay relevant, because like, you're seeing Commerce Tools eat into the market share of Salesforce now. So it's just a matter of time. Like Adobe acquired Magento. I feel like that was a bit of a strange move. Like, why would you acquire? I mean, I don't know how much you know about Magento, but like from the V1 to V2, like I kind of watched from the sidelines. It's like the product vision seems to have become sort of derailed, and they sort of hitched their wagon to some very strange technical choices, like in the monolith. And yes, you can do headless with Magento or Salesforce and things. You can do it to some degree. But at the same time, you kind of end up and the same for Shopify. You kind of end up in a weird place in the middle where you're getting the benefits of maybe the headless storefront, but you're not getting the benefits on the back end, like the business process, because you kind of throw away all the benefits of the monolith by doing a hybrid. You can no longer rely on the plugins. You can no longer rely on the existing ecosystem of things that exist. So people get all the benefits on the front end, but then they kind of realize once they go live that, hey, we're in a bit of a no man's land now. We've lost a lot of things too. So yeah, I don't know how it can work out when you just have a hybrid. You kind of need to have both sides of the solution, I think. So yeah, and then you got the really old players like SAP and Oracle, IBM, etc. There are still customers on those platforms, but they are beginning to migrate off. They're like the laggards in the space. So that it has the life cycle of companies as they go through their growth curves and then their gradual declines. And so I think it's a good way of illustrating it is also my gut feel. I've got for the y-axis, it's the vision of the company and the founding team, and I've got my own grades, and over time that vision axis grows, and there are new things that get added that like you're seeing low code and no code environments and things now, which kind of add up to that vision. And then on the x-axis you have execution capabilities. So you can imagine larger companies are like oil tankers, and they become much harder to move and make decisions and shift. Small companies, startups can move really fast, and they have a lot of three guys from Newcastle. Case in point, Moltin was up against Magento and Shopify. They have hundreds and hundreds of developers that are building out their platform features, and three guys from Newcastle managed to create an e-commerce platform, bare bones e-commerce platform, with very limited resources.
Absolutely.
Kind of just proves the point. So yeah, like you say, it becomes harder to execute, and that's kind of why companies can go from high execution capabilities to low, because there are other forces at work. There's kind of a lot packed into that diagram.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I see this diagram also saying something like the success is sometimes a golden cage, and limiting you from being still relevant. Because your technology is then aging faster than new players. And actually, the next question is about the future of the e-commerce enterprise software market. How you see it, and where do you see a space for new players actually?
Yeah, so I kind of go back to the problems with headless and Mac microservices and things. So you get all the benefits of flexibility, but then complexity kind of comes with that. And we saw a lot of companies doing 80% of the work would be the same, just the setup and the configuration of those things, the integrations of how the standard data flows exist between them. So you're seeing the MACH Alliance and things form now to kind of solve some of those things where these companies are partnering with each other in the enterprise space, which is great. I feel like we're not far away from low code interfaces where instead of these things being done in code, they're done via UI, and that's probably the space that exists for the e-com side. That's what people are doing in code in Moltin, and I feel like there's an easier way to do that. And taking a leaf out of the Webflow book or something, or maybe even I see maybe DigitalOcean for e-commerce, where you have deploy buttons and things. And
gotcha. Yeah.
I feel like that's that would be big. And maybe and it's not necessarily even just the e-commerce platform that could do that. An e-commerce platform could take their product vision in that direction. The CMS could do that. A lot of players could do that and rush towards that spectrum. Or you could just have someone that that is just doing the orchestration and isn't doing any other features. So it could be additive, or it could be greenfield.
Actually, what you just said, I read we are halfway with this headless, right? And there is still plenty of space for enablers that make headless more digestible for the business users, no-code platforms and the environments that put all those things together. For me, are actually exactly this. And on the other hand, you need to educate the market, and the MACH Alliance I see as a very, very important initiative to that.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of, I feel like we're in a good space. The headless and sort of the Mac like technology is maturing rapidly, and like the next two, like one or two steps ahead of us are very, like I think it's for the industry it's fairly obvious. It's sort of the chink in the armor for microservices is in those integration points. It's like the weakness. It's a lot of the time spent by the implementation teams is in sort of what happens when something goes wrong, like what happens when like something fails, like what are the retry policies, when does a human have to get involved in a process, that kind of, we saw like for example, like the order would be placed on Moltin and then it would be passed through to a fulfillment like warehouse or something, or a fulfillment system. What happens if that request fails for whatever reason? What happens if you're doing a retry and then maybe you're getting race conditions and things like what? There's like all kinds of weird edge cases that can happen. And if you're a brand that is trying to do like next day deliveries, like trying to offer the Amazon level experience, like you can't have any delays. Like minutes or seconds can matter if the customer's trying to get their order in before the cutoff point for the next day delivery. So you end up sort of having like these reporting systems that you're kind of baking in to kind of monitor that connection. We saw a few customers do that. Out of necessity, that they would have to over-engineer that integration point, and then they would even have like a manual sort of a dashboard that they could log into, like for one of their reps every day, to just check if there's anything kind of stuck and just manually push it through. Even after the machines failed like maybe 3 or 4 times, like you can't. Gotcha, yeah. It wouldn't necessarily even be like a Moltin issue. Obviously, like Moltin's is maybe integrating and communicating with like really old technology, with like lots of bugs and things like ERPs and fulfillment warehouse platforms that are really, really, really old. So they would fail. So it's not even necessarily about sort of like the commerce platform. It could be some other component, and that exists for everything. Like it's like these edge cases are really hard to sort of predict. And that's sort of why I feel like the low code stuff and sort of like paving the road for people and sort of having those edge cases and having those robust integrations will really help from a complexity management standpoint. We had a lot of customers sort of implementing like New Relic and Datadog and like things to monitor their own technology stacks that they're building. It seems like kind of crazy that they kind of would have to do that. It would be sort of a good problem to solve.
Yeah, sure. So which technology trends are over and which are underhyped?
I think the Jamstack sort of helps on the front end, and serverless functions and things too. Like you can do a lot in like 50 lines of code in a serverless function, so that sort of really helps. I'm not sure if that's sort of overhyping or just sort of assisting. Obviously, like the adoption of sort of cloud, like AWS, that kind of thing, has sort of helped like bring down the barriers. I'm trying to think of something that is like overhyping. I feel like microservices maybe in and of themselves, like the concept of size of a service is a bit of hype. Like it helps to have a conversation between the difference between a monolith and a microservice, but like each product and service is of a different size. Like you look at Commerce Tools, it's a suite of services, for example. Yes, they could be microservices. You could also think of Commerce Tools as a whole entity, that it's kind of like a macro service. Like there's lots of microservices together. They're not necessarily like a full monolith, but they're kind of some quasi sort of in between. And as products mature and get bigger, like they get more features and more services sort of added. So that's kind of why I guess you're seeing sort of the rise of the term like composable commerce, which is sort of we had a vote internally. It's a good story behind this. We had a vote internally, like I think it was like late 2018, early 2019, sort of what would sort of be the next thing after sort of Mac architecture as an industry term. And we had a vote between open commerce and composable commerce, and our engineering team preferred composable commerce. And I think obviously that's being pitched to the analysts now, and I think everyone's sort of on the same page. It's sort of again sort of mutual discovery and things. And Gartner has trademarked the term composable commerce, and everyone's talking about composable commerce now. So that's kind of it's funny to see sort of the genesis of a term and sort of how it kind of goes into the market and things.
Gotcha.
So that was how Moltin was going to kind of compete against Commerce Tools, like Mac versus composable, and we were trying to remove the sizeism from the equation. But I feel like some of the terminology, what we were trying to bake into that term, has been watered down in the delivery and execution of that, from not just like Moltin and ElasticPath, but from everybody. Everyone is able to adopt that term now. So it's almost like headless. It loses its meaning a little bit along the way, a bit unfortunately, but But yeah, I feel like that's kind of what's great about the Mac Alliance is they've got like criteria for entry, and it feels like something sort of needs to exist. Like maybe there's something beyond sort of composable that needs to exist. Like again,
Gotcha.
like more acronyms, probably more things for people to be confused about.
Okay, Adam, thank you for being my guest, for taking the time talking.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was a great talk. Guys, if you have any more questions, feel free to put them into comments and we will try to answer. Thank you very much and be with us next week.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the CTO to CTO podcast. If you enjoyed this show and if you found this episode useful and informative in any way, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. This can help us tremendously in reaching other listeners who might also be interested in these topics. And of course, as always, we'll be back with great content next week.